I had mixed sleeping pills in the tea for my husband and mother-in-law, and now I was satisfied that neither of them would wake up before morning. They would never find out what happened tonight. I peeked into my mother-in-law's room and found her deep in sleep as well. After confirming, I changed my clothes, applied makeup to my face, and when I looked critically at myself in the mirror, I found myself looking extremely beautiful. Now I was sure that when I arrived at the Hakim's, herbalist's clinic, he would be delighted just by seeing me and would reveal the secret I was so desperately eager to know. Since my husband and mother-in-law were both in a deep sleep, caution still demanded that I leave the house for the Hakim's clinic without catching the neighbors' attention. My younger brother-in-law also lived next door, so I peered into his house from outside and saw that it was completely in darkness. I was confident that none of them would be able to find out what I was up to tonight. And the Hakim's clinic was only a short distance away. The Hakim lived with his wife and children, which was why he had called me to the clinic instead of his home. It was impossible for him to meet me at his house. When I arrived at the clinic, the Hakim was already waiting for me. As soon as he saw me, an obvious admiration appeared in his eyes. He grabbed me tightly and, in a heady whisper, asked in my ear whether anyone had seen me coming there. I felt uneasy at his closeness. After all, it was my first time being that close to another man. A month had passed since my wedding, yet my husband had neither come near me nor touched me. In the early days, I remained silent out of shyness, and I never brought it up with him or asked any questions, but gradually, as my shyness wore off, it was replaced by bewilderment and anger. I couldn't understand why my husband was treating me this way. Did he not like me? Was there someone else in his heart? If he loved another girl, then why did he marry me in the first place? When 2 months passed, I finally put my shyness aside and asked my husband about it. At first, he got a bit flustered and then told me that I should be ashamed of myself for speaking to him like that. Any modest woman would rather die than discuss such things with her husband. Hearing those words, I fell silent, thinking that perhaps it really was improper for me to say such things. But the question still remained. Why had he not established any relationship with me yet? After all, what was my fault in all this? Everyone used to say that I was extremely beautiful, that I would rule over my husband's heart. But here the situation was the complete opposite. Far from ruling his heart, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. Whenever I was in the room with him, he seemed annoyed and restless, as if he wanted to run away. Then another 2 months passed, and my mother-in-law started asking me repeatedly whether sitting or standing when I'd give them some good news. Hearing this, I would sometimes feel embarrassed and other times frustrated, wondering how I could become a mother when my husband had no relationship with me. At my wit's end, I confided in a friend about it. She said that the new Hakim in our village was extremely knowledgeable, and she was sure he had a solution for my problem. The very next day, I made an excuse about visiting my mother's house and went to the Hakim's clinic with my friend. At that time, the clinic wasn't busy, but I still felt shy talking to him about my problem. Seeing my hesitation, the Hakim sent my friend outside and told me to speak freely about my issue. When I explained everything to him, he looked at me thoughtfully and then said he did have a solution. He told me he could give me medicine that would give my husband the strength of 100 men, but the cost of that medicine was very high. When I heard how expensive it was, I was worried about where I could possibly get that much money. Noticing my distress, the Hakim told me he could give me the medicine for free, but in exchange, I would have to do something for him. His words left me stunned. He went on to say that I would have to spend one night with him. Hearing that, I was revolted. The Hakim was old enough to be my father, and he should have thought 100 times before saying such things to me. But I knew he was the only one who had the cure for my husband's condition, and if he refused to give me the medicine, I might be condemned to live like this my entire life. I had no choice but to agree, yet I was worried about how I would leave my house without raising suspicion. What if someone saw me? That was a serious concern, but again, the Hakim solved that problem by giving me sleeping pills and telling me to mix them into tea for my husband and mother-in-law. With trembling hands, I mixed the sleeping pills into their tea, and as they drank it, they drifted into a deep sleep. And so, I ended up at the Hakim's clinic, alone with him for the first time in my life, which was new and oddly thrilling for me. But thank goodness, as he took his leave afterward, he gave me the promised medicine. He had kept his word. Returning home with the medicine, I was overjoyed that now my wish would finally be fulfilled. I had guarded my body and emotions my entire life, saving them for my husband alone, knowing I was his trust, that I owed it to him not to betray him. But what I had just experienced felt like a shock. My husband was impotent and incapable of fulfilling my rights, but with this medicine, he could become completely cured and my longing could be satisfied. The next day, my mother-in-law told me she was going to the market and would return soon. After she left, I was busy with household chores when I heard the doorbell. I was surprised she came back so quickly, so I opened the door expecting to see her. But there stood my brother-in-law, wearing a peculiar gleam in his eyes as he entered the house. He said, "I saw Mother leaving the house, so I thought I'd come to see how you're doing." I was taken aback by why he would feel the need to come into the house just because I was alone. Then, with a sinister grin, he asked me where I'd gone last night. I tried my best to keep a neutral expression and told him I hadn't gone anywhere. I was home all night. But he laughed strangely and said he knew exactly where I had gone. Then he played a recording on his phone in which I was lost in a world of pleasure with that Hakim. When I saw that footage, every hair on my body stood on end. He watched me with a malicious smile and said, "If you don't want me to tell your husband or anyone else about this, you'll have to do the same thing with me." I was terrified. I begged him not to reveal anything, telling him that my life would be ruined, that my husband would leave me. But he had no pity whatsoever. He said I had to satisfy him if I wanted him to keep silent. Otherwise, he would expose me. I was utterly shocked because he was my husband's brother, and I was a member of his family. He should have reprimanded me for doing something so wrong, but instead, he tried to blackmail me and exploit my misfortune. I explained to him why I had gone to the Hakim, that I was compelled to do so because of my husband's condition, but he replied, "I can fulfill all your desires. If my brother isn't giving you time, I'll give you plenty." At that moment, my mother-in-law suddenly returned home, and I silently thanked God because who knows what he might have done. That night, when my husband came home, I slipped him the medicine mixed in water, just as the Hakim had instructed. And it worked exactly as the Hakim had promised. Every day, I gave my husband this medicine, and my grievances with him vanished. I no longer had any complaints or sorrow because he was now able to fulfill my marital rights, but in the meantime, my brother-in-law was making my life miserable, constantly blackmailing me, threatening to reveal everything. And the Hakim, too, sent me messages through my friend, asking me to come see him. Reluctantly, I had to go again. Otherwise, he threatened to expose me as well. When I met him, he began insisting on another encounter. Fear seized me. I pleaded with him not to do this, telling him it would destroy my life and break my marriage. But the Hakim wouldn't listen. He said that if I wanted my husband to be permanently cured, he had prepared a special medicine. Once my husband took that, I would never complain again. Now I was terribly anxious about what to do. My brother-in-law was tormenting me, and the Hakim was demanding another meeting. He started talking to me suggestively, even in front of my husband and mother-in-law, to the point that my husband began to notice. One day, my husband asked me privately why his brother spoke in that strange way. Had anything happened between the two of us? His question terrified me, and I brushed it off, insisting there was nothing. I didn't want him to suspect me. Another day, my brother-in-law tried to force himself on me, but just then, my husband came home. Seeing us together in the room, my husband's expression changed. The moment he appeared, my brother-in-law changed his demeanor and told him, "I have a headache, so I came to ask her to make some tea. My wife is visiting her parents, and that's why I came to Bobby, sister-in-law." My husband just smiled and left, not asking me any questions or mentioning it again. Still, I was afraid that deep down he suspected something and might be thinking all sorts of things. But when he didn't bring it up again, I dismissed it as my own paranoia that he might be giving it importance. Meanwhile, the Hakim kept sending me messages through my friend almost every other day, wanting me to come see him. But now that I already had what I wanted, the question of meeting him again simply didn't arise. However, when my husband's condition started to relapse, I remembered that the Hakim had mentioned a special medicine that would cure him permanently. I decided I had to go to the Hakim one more time to get that medicine. One day, my husband said he wouldn't be coming home that night because of work in another city. The moment he said that, I resolved to take advantage of being alone and go to the Hakim's clinic that very night. It was a rare opportunity. Once again, I mixed sleeping pills into tea for my mother-in-law. I waited until the late hours because I suspected my brother-in-law would still be awake, and I remembered how he had caught me slipping out before. If he saw me again, it would mean big trouble. He was already salivating over me and dying to spend time with me. So I waited until the deep hours of the night. But then I heard the sound of someone at the door. I was stunned. Who could it be at this hour? When I opened my bedroom door, I found my brother-in-law standing there, and I was speechless. I didn't know what to do. He forcibly entered the room saying, "Why are you avoiding me? I really love you. I can make you happier than your husband ever could. Why are you so afraid of me? Am I worse than that Hakeem?" At his words, I broke into tears. I begged him, "I am your brother's honor. You shouldn't do this to me." But he was clearly overcome by his desires and wouldn't listen to anything. He tried to force himself on me again while I kept resisting, telling him, "I am not that kind of woman. I only did what I did out of sheer desperation. You have no idea the torment and agony I've been through. It's unbearable." My pleading had no effect on him at all. Just then, my eyes fell on the doorway, and there stood my husband, watching us in disbelief. He must have heard our conversation. At that sight, my blood froze, and my brother-in-law was just as terrified because he was deeply afraid of his elder brother. Trying to pin the blame on me, he said, "Your wife herself called me into the room. She's been trying to tempt me. She said you're impotent, that you can't satisfy her." My husband angrily slapped him across the face. "I heard everything you two were saying," he snapped. "I know now that none of this is my wife's fault. You were trying to force yourself on her." Hearing that, I felt immense relief. My husband believed me. If he had listened to his brother's lies and thrown me out of the house, I would have been ruined. Where would I have gone? My parents' house belonged more to my brothers and sisters-in-law than to me, and they wouldn't tolerate me staying there for long, but the next moment was even more shocking. In order to prove me guilty, my brother-in-law played the video on his phone showing me and the Hakeem lost in our sexual escapade. As my husband watched it, his expression changed, and rage filled his eyes like blood. He came at me in a fury, and I fell at his feet, pleading, "I did this out of desperation. If you had fulfilled my rights, if you had sought treatment, I never would have done this. It was my last resort." As soon as I said that, the hand he'd raised to hit me froze midair, and he became strangely quiet. Then he kicked his brother out of the house without another word, and without saying anything else to me, he left the room. The next day, when I woke up, my husband was gone. He had left for the office without having breakfast. I discovered that my mother-in-law knew nothing of what had transpired. All day I was like a person walking on hot coals, fearing that if my husband decided to throw me out of the house, what would I do? That evening, he returned home, still upset. He wouldn't eat or talk. He went straight to the bedroom and sat quietly. I went and knelt before him, crying, begging him to forgive me for what had happened. I insisted it wasn't deliberate treachery, that I'd done it out of necessity. I'd never intended to deceive him. As for his brother, he'd tried to blackmail me. I had never thought about forming a relationship with him, and even in death I wouldn't do such a thing. Then I broke down in sobs. He said, "I have no complaint against you. I'm angry at myself for not trying to understand your feelings. I should have realized that the woman who is married to me also has emotions and needs, but out of my own inferiority complex, I failed to give you your rightful due as my wife. And because I feared disgrace, I didn't seek treatment. I never imagined this error of mine could become so terrible that I would lose my self-respect like this. I don't blame you, and I'm not going to turn you out of this house." In that moment, I realized how big-hearted my husband truly was. Then, not only did he sternly warn his brother never to harass me again, he also hid the entire incident from his mother, keeping her completely in the dark about what had occurred. My brother-in-law became so ashamed afterward that he avoided me entirely. My husband then visited a Hakeem in the city for proper treatment, and he fully recovered. Soon after, he took me and his mother and moved to the city. There, we started our life anew. By undergoing comprehensive treatment in the city, my husband became perfectly capable of fulfilling all my marital rights, and in time, God blessed us further. I became pregnant. My joy knew no bounds. I felt like I was floating above the earth with happiness. After that, I barely visited my brother-in-law's house at all. My mother-in-law sometimes asked me to go with her, but my husband would flatly refuse, saying, "My wife has no reason to go there." She was startled by his response and had no idea what had happened or why he was acting this way. But she kept silent for the sake of peace. One day I heard that my brother-in-law had been blessed with a daughter. The very next day, he came to me, his hands folded in remorse. He said, Please forgive me for what I did to you. I had no sense of my sin before, but now that I have a daughter of my own, I understand how precious a daughter's honor is, and that one should never exploit another woman's helplessness. His words made me happy because he had finally realized his mistake. I forgave him, and my husband, showing generosity, forgave him as well.